Hey everybody, it's Mr. B here, and I am here today to talk to you guys about the topic cellular energy. And when I say this, I'm specifically referring to the process in which organisms take in an energy resource, break it down into smaller, more reusable units, and then use these units for different cellular or life processes. But before we go over and talk about how cells specifically do this, we need to go over the fact that all living things need energy, specifically plants, animals, humans, and bacteria. We all use glucose as our main energy resource. And again, this is a monosaccharide and part of the carbohydrate family. So what happens is we take in glucose, and then in order to use it, it needs to be broken down into smaller, more reusable forms of energy known as ATP. And then this ATP is used for different examples of cellular work. So one example is the mechanical work shown up here in the top left. And what ATP is used for in this case is it is used to actually move the tail of the sperm or that flagellum to allow motion in that cell. Now, in example B, transport work, this refers back to the idea that active transport uses energy, and in this case it's ATP, to move different objects or substances across the membrane. So that would be one example of transport work. And then the final example of chemical work would be how ATP can be used within enzymes to speed up the chemical reaction or the rate of reaction, as well as lower that activation energy for that overall reaction. So rather than burning up all the energy of one glucose molecule at one time, cells convert that energy into smaller reusable molecules known as ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. And one unique characteristic of this molecule is that it tends to store a significant amount of energy between the second and third phosphate groups. And the reason is because this plays a role in ATP's ability to convert itself into another molecule. And the reason why this conversion happens is because when glucose is broken down, this is a very high energy chemical reaction that releases a ton of energy. And in order to consume and use all of this released energy, it needs to be able to convert ATP into ADP in order to store energy more effectively. So ADP, or adenosine diphosphate, is the conversion form of ATP when the third phosphate group is lost and the chemical bond between those two atoms is broken. So again, ATP releases a large amount of energy stored in a high energy chemical bond between that second and third phosphate. And they do this in order to allow the cell to use this energy for other cellular processes like we talked about, either mechanical, chemical, or transport work. With that being said, ATP can also regain that phosphate group. And the way it does this is that the cells within our body actually store energy from different foods that are high in starch or sugars. And by doing this, it allows that third phosphate group to be rejoined on back at the end of that original ATP molecule. So think of it like recharging a battery where you have your ATP molecule. It now needs to be used. That energy is used elsewhere. So it's no longer ATP, it's ADP. And in order to recharge that molecule or get it back to its original form, we need to consume glucose or different foods that allow this energy to become stored and allow that third phosphate to join back on. So again, ATP is useful for transferring energy, but is not good for storing large amounts of energy. So for example, a single molecule of glucose stores more than 90 times the chemical energy. And that is again because as this chemical bond breaks, there's a large amount of energy that's released. And in order to use all that energy within the cell, ATP needs to convert back and forth to store as much of it as possible. So now the process that actually talks about and goes over glucose being broken down into smaller subunits or smaller reusable forms is specifically called cellular respiration. And this is a process that occurs all the time within our bodies. And again, it is an energy extracting reaction that allows the breakdown of glucose into ATP. So notice here on the bottom, I have the numerical chemical formula as well as the written chemical formula. So again, it is glucose plus oxygen yields or produces to give you carbon dioxide, water, and energy. And in this case, that energy is ATP. So specifically, this process occurs in the mitochondria within the cells. So what happens is glucose and oxygen enter the mitochondria. Then Within the mitochondria, this glucose interacts with different enzymes, and as a result, you have ATP, water, and carbon dioxide. So again, those enzymes that specifically break down this chemical or this sugar is found within the mitochondria, and they're found specifically in the cristae, which are the folds inside the mitochondria. And here's where that actual process of glucose being broken down and made into ATP is housed. So now that we've gone over cellular respiration and know that is an ongoing process that is constantly occurring, there are two types that occur within our body. It's aerobic, which is the respiration process in which oxygen is available, and anaerobic, which is the process in which oxygen is not available. Today we're going to look at aerobic. So again, this is the respiration process in which glucose is broken down into ATP with the presence of oxygen. This occurs in both prokaryotic and eukaryotic organisms. So again, organisms that may not be able to house or have a mitochondria still can undergo this process. So again, this chemical equation is the same that we looked at for cellular respiration, and that's because of this appearance of oxygen. So cellular respiration really truly occurs when oxygen's available, or aerobic respiration occurs. And again, this type of reaction tends to release a large amount of energy, and that energy is coming from that second and third phosphate bond being broken. And one other unique characteristic about this type of respiration is that its byproducts, oxygen and carbon dioxide, are very easily removed through gas exchange and active transport within our lungs out of the body. So within aerobic respiration, there's three steps: glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. But before we go into those, I just want to say that at some point, all of us have performed or been a part of an aerobic activity. It's essentially an exercise that looks to go from low to high intensity. So things such as walking, hiking, and cycling would be examples of this. So the first step in aerobic respiration is glycolysis. Here, there's no oxygen available, so it's an anaerobic process. So it's not the true first step in which cellular respiration occurs. This takes place in the cytoplasm, and specifically what's happening is that glucose molecule is getting broken up into two 3-carbon molecules, or pyruvates, and two ATP molecules. But since there is no oxygen available, that cell must invest two ATP molecules for the process to occur. So in the end, you end up with 4 ATP molecules, 2 molecules of NADH, and 2 molecules of pyruvate. Now, officially, cellular respiration will start when that oxygen becomes available. And when it is available, that glucose molecule is said to enter the Krebs cycle. And the Krebs cycle is specifically occurring in the mitochondrial matrix. And here is where that 3-carbon molecule, or those pyruvates, are broken down even further. So notice here within the mitochondrial matrix and this cycle, there's not as much ATP being used, but this is the step where carbon dioxide becomes a byproduct, as well as the 2 energy-carrying molecules that will drive the breakdown of glucose are formed. So these energy molecules are specifically NADH and FADH2, and they make ATP, and the way they do that is they allow hydrogen ions to move through the plasma membrane, and through this movement, this ion and these molecules interact with an enzyme known as ATP synthase, and that's actually the enzyme responsible for breaking down glucose into ATP. So during this process, water becomes a byproduct, as well as there's a large release of energy. So one single molecule of glucose can make up to 38 molecules of ATP. So now that we've gone over aerobic respiration, we're going to refer back to this slideshow and the recorded lesson for anaerobic. But that's all that we have for today. So please, as we move into the next level, refer back and make sure we understand all the key words and concepts associated within this video.